presenters to be able to engage a broader audience. Now, a lot of you are PhD students. A lot of you are probably sleep deprived. So maybe it's an opportunity you're giving your fellow students to catch up on a little bit of sleep that you're losing in your overnight lab time. However, what you're really losing is some major opportunities in two ways. You're losing one opportunity of maybe getting a bit of feedback. Sometimes these presentations, like the seminar presentations in your centers, maybe it's an opportunity to kind of talk about your science to people who aren't specifically in your field, but related. And maybe they have some ideas of ways that you can further address these gaps in your research. And maybe they have some ideas of, have you tried this? Have you done this? I've been to a lot of these centers, some really engaging discussion, and people have come away with some good ideas of where to go next with their research, all because they had a nice engaging presentation. And on the other side, I think, we're talking these days in science, there's lots of opportunities for collaboration. If you're talking, if you're giving a presentation to a Kaustwide audience or to other scientists in other fields, if you're considering that audience in a way that maybe they can understand what you're doing and the impact, might be lots of opportunities for collaboration with researchers in fields you never imagined you would be able to collaborate with. So having this situation, putting the majority of people in your audience to sleep because you're only really talking to a small minority of your audience, you're missing out on lots of potential opportunities for those things. So having said that, I wanted to focus today on how can we maybe wake all those people up at the table and maybe open up those opportunities. So a couple of things we're going to cover today. I want to talk about how to, what to think about before you even start planning your presentation, what to consider before you even start opening your slide deck and started creating those slides. I think most novice presenters, they right away, the first thing to do is they open up PowerPoint or Canva or some other system and just start making slides and trying to organize that way. And already you've probably lost your organization. So thinking about what to do before you start, then how do you design your story? Buzzword these days, everyone says, tell a scientific story, tell a story, but nobody really tells you how to do that or what that means. I'm going to try to share today what I think that means today and help you along with that. And then finally, we'll look at how to create effective slides, how to make good slides. Once you design your story, once you know about, what to think about before you start, now let's start opening the slides and start creating those slides. Okay, so let's get into before you start. First of all, first thing you want to think about is, what is the purpose of my presentation? What's my objective? And quite often students come to me with help and they say, can I just practice my presentation? And the first thing they think about is, can you just help me with my English? I just need to help, how do I say this? How do I say that? And then I say, let's sit down for a second. So tell me about your presentation. What are you hoping to accomplish? And quite often people say, I don't know, and I say, well, what do you hope the audience learns by the end of this presentation? I don't know, I just have to present my research, so you need to think about, first of all, what is my objective? What do I hope to have as an outcome? Before you can do that, you really need to ask yourself a first question, and that is, who is my audience? Who actually am I going to present to? And this seems so basic, but quite often, again, I've seen presentations where it's very clear they presented this slide deck before. Someone asked them, can you present your research? And they just presented the exact duplicate presentation, even though it's a completely different audience. It's a different group, different background. It might even be you had 15 minutes to present before, now you only have 10. How can you present that same presentation with the same, with a different audience, a different objective? So you have to think about, who is my audience? What's my objective? What outcome do I want to have? And then you can start to think about what's going to go into that presentation. Okay. Now, as far as what the audience knows or who your audience is, now you have to think about, okay, what is their background? What's their technical knowledge? Are they really, highly technical in my field? Are they technical in other fields, but maybe not quite as related to my field? Is half of the audience people like Matt who have no scientific background whatsoever? So who is my audience and what's going to be important to them? And then finally, what should the audience know, which is my objective? I always struggle with how to keep this bullet point, because I don't know if it should be what should the audience know, because that's a little bit more driven by what you feel, or what does the audience want to know, what's important to them. I think you kind of have to think a little bit about both. What's going to be important to the audience, but also maybe there might be things that the audience needs to know and they don't even know it's important. So you have to kind of make those decisions. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later on. And finally, you've seen a lot of kind of audience objective, which is all very important, extremely important. But we can't lose sight as well of how much time do you have Definitely don't want to go over, you give a certain amount of time, you don't want to go over that amount of time. As I mentioned, you may have a 15-minute presentation and now you're given 10 minutes. You have to make some decisions. How do I trim that down from 15 to 10 rather than just trying to speak faster? That's never the answer. So, you know, all these information, who my audience, what their background is, what they need to know, what's my objective, how much time, all it's going to go into before I even design my story. What elements do I prepare? What elements do I put in my presentation? Or what elements do I have to leave out? Which is the most difficult decision to make. Okay. So I kind of want to take us through a journey, and kind of the journey that most of you feel. So you're a scientist, you're in the lab, you know, a lot of you are in a wet lab doing different things, you know, whatever you're doing in your lab out in the field. And what most people feel is what their job is to leave the lab coat on, go out there and present my research and just present all my data. And you just data dump and you overload your audience with data. You need to change this mentality. You're not presenting your research. You're not presenting your paper. That's not your objective. And I know it sounds a bit controversial to say, but ultimately what you are is you're a salesperson. You're selling your research. So you get a limited amount of time. If you're out at a conference, you might have 10 minutes to present your research. You're going to give a little bit of introduction, motivation, talk about some methods. Really have, within that 10 minutes, not a lot of time to get into the novelty of what you've done. So ultimately what you're doing is just trying to pique the interest of your audience enough that they're going to want to approach you and talk to you. They're going to want to go read your paper. They're going to want to talk to you offline after the case, or maybe ask you a few questions. They want to get engaged into your research and find out more. You're not going to be able to tell them all the important elements and aspects in the short amount of time you typically have. So this is why I said your objective, your goal is not to present, but you're selling your paper, you're selling your research, just to pique the interest of your audience, that they come and approach you more, and now they engage you in that conversation. The way you know you've had a successful presentation, if there are a lot of questions. People are asking a lot of questions because they're really interested in what you have to say, and they understand what you sold to them. Okay. So now, as a part of this, you have to be able to communicate your arguments and your key findings. We're going to focus more on the body of your presentation later, but the important thing here is the key findings. And I think too often, again, presenters try to talk about everything that they've done, and you just don't have enough time to ask that. So what key findings? Now, in your research, you might have a lot of key findings. You might have 3 or 4 different aspects. You have to think about, okay, in this particular presentation, which key findings are going to be valuable to my audience? So for one particular audience, one part of my finding might be very valuable. For a different audience, a different key finding or a different objective might be more valuable. So it's thinking about what in particular is important to this audience. So some of you have heard me give the analogy before, but I love to give the analogy that if I have all of you to my house for a dinner, and I want to just present what I care about. I want to serve dinner about what I care about. And I love meat. If any of you know me, I'm a meat eater. I love my steak. I love my burgers. I love, barbecue. However, if all of you are coming to my house and you're vegetarians, now I'm serving you what I care about, and I'm not thinking about what my audience cares about. Now you're going to come to my house with this big table full of meat, and as a vegetarian, you're not going to be very happy. You're not going to be very interested in this dinner. In the same way you're doing this as presenters, if you're not considering what your audience cares about as vegetarians, and you're trying to serve them the meat of your presentation, not the vegetarian side of your presentation, nobody's going to be interested. And we're going to go back to that first slide that you saw of everybody sleeping or disinterested, because you haven't really thought about what's valuable to my audience. You're only thinking about what's valuable to you. And that's not what a presentation is about. It's not about you. It's about what part of your research is really relatable and important to your audience. And again, as I said, different audiences are going to have different things important to them. Okay. And then we want to be relevant enough and want to listen, which is related to that value. So am I saying something that's valuable enough? Am I serving them steak when they want vegetables, or am I just giving them a true vegetarian meal that they can really come away with and feel that they got some value from this dinner at my house, or got some value from this 10-minute presentation I've given them? Okay. All right. So once we've considered that, we've considered who my audience is, what objective do I want? What are some key elements of my research? How I go, we've designed this story. So we want to design our scientific story. As I said, you probably hear this all the time these days when you're writing or when you're presenting, of design a story, tell a scientific story. And like I said, nobody really tells you what that means or how to do that. And, you don't want to say once upon a time, my research did this, but really it is going to follow that same model. So let me kind of give you some of the aspects of how to design that story, and it's going to have similar elements to any other story. So first of all, you want to kind of know, what is my objective? Again, what outcome do I want my audience to know? And everything that I make decisions about, of what part of my results, what part of my methods, if part of my results aren't related to that objective, get them out of the presentation. They don't belong in there, right? So it's really knowing your objective is going to help you make decisions of what part of my paper, what part of my research are relevant to this particular talk, and what part, while they're really exciting results and exciting breakthroughs, they're not really relevant to this particular talk. Those are part of a different presentation that I hope to do to a different audience one day. And really, those are extremely difficult decisions to make. I work with presenters all the time. In fact, I'm working with a student right now who's preparing a TED Talk. He sent me his kind of whole talk, his whole 2.5 pages, I think a 10-minute talk or so. And I saw about 5 different objectives. I said, really, what is your point? He said, well, this story is just a really cool story. I said, but does that meet the objective of what you're trying to say? I said, no, but I want to tell this story. And it's just so hard to let go of these things that are so important and so cool to you, but really not relevant to that objective. And what I tell them is, I'm not saying that this story isn't important. What I'm saying is it's not important for this particular presentation. You need to make those decisions, and you need to be honest with yourself. But what is that objective? Now, once I know my objective and what I hope my audience learns by the end of this presentation, now I have to think about what results, what information, what results did I achieve in my research that are a part of that particular objective. Now, the objective could be, fitting a certain scientific technical gap within my field. Maybe it's a bigger picture objective that filling that gap is going to ultimately fit in a bigger picture, world type thing for an audience like Matt. Thinking about what that objective is now, what results are related to that objective, and how do they fit into that objective? Okay. Now, once you've done that with results, now it's thinking about, okay, what methods did I do? What novel methods, what unique methods did I do that helped me achieve those results? So how did I outcome to those results? So you're really kind of almost working backward, right? So you're starting with, what did I achieve that met my objective? How did I get there? So you're not starting big picture and working down. You're starting with the detail and working your way backward to make sure everything's going to link in. So what unique methods did I do? Now, notice I'm putting unique methods. I'm not saying go through and say, first I did this, then I did this. You don't want to go through all the details of your methods. You want to really highlight, what is it that I've done differently from either what's the standard method or maybe what's currently out there in the literature. Maybe you talk a little bit about, here are some areas that some other researchers in my field have addressed to fill the same gap and same objective that I've been trying to address. And here what I've done to add to that. And here's what I've done differently to address that. In addition to that, you might want to talk a little bit about maybe that aha moment. Maybe I was out the weekend in Waba Crater and just couldn't get this problem off my mind. And finally, I just saw this thing in nature and I thought, that might work in the lab. So, sometimes you have that aha moment. Maybe it's part of your literature reading. Maybe it's something you just saw. Maybe it's a conversation. Something ultimately led you to trying this unique method differently from what's going on out there. So these standard methods, you're not going through all the standard methods, but what is related to what did I do different from the standard? So you're just kind of highlighting. And this is the way that you can keep your objective within a shorter time period of a presentation. You're not going through details of all the methods you've done, which is typically what I see as an error. First I did this, and 15 minutes of just methods. What you want to do is really focus on, what did I do uniquely and what unique result or key finding did I get because of what I've done differently from what's the standard or what's current out there in the literature. Okay. And then you want to talk about why those results matter. This is going to get back into your motivation, your objective. So what was my motivation? What problem was I trying to achieve? How do these results ultimately fit into this gap that I was trying to achieve? How are my results kind of fitting within that objective, that motivation that all of us are looking for in our field? Okay. So starts with the introduction. Obviously, in an introduction, we have different ways we go about an introduction. So what you're really trying to do in an introduction is kind of connect with your audience very much in the beginning. And I mentioned you have to know your audience, what they care about, what's valuable to them. So you want to describe your motivation for your research and describe what problem were you trying to address. Again, you can't think about the steak side of it. You got to think of the vegetarian side of it. So what part of my research, what part of my motivation will my audience really relate to? And if your audience can relate to your motivation and they can feel as motivated by solving this problem as you are, now you've got them, you've got the hook, and they want to listen to the rest of your presentation. So if you set up a problem in a way that your audience says, yeah, that's really a problem I've been trying to address in our science, or that's a problem I think that the world needs to be addressed to see fixed or to see minimized, then ultimately your audience is going to really say like, okay, I care about this as well. Now show me what you've done to help this. Show me what you've done in your research to try to address this problem that I care about as well. So you have to make your audience care about what motivates you and what's motivated you and what problem you're trying to address. And the only way you can really know how to relate that is to kind of get in the mind of your audience of what do they care about? What are their hot buttons? What are the areas? And it's not just, again, within the area of your research or your lab. Okay. Once you've done that, now you've really set up the context throughout your presentation. Once you set up the problem and the motivation, what you've done, now as you're talking the rest of your talk, you're setting up context for your key findings. What I say gives you an anchor. So as you're talking about some key findings, you say, now what this means is, if you remember that problem I talked about in the beginning of my talk, here's how these results are linking into that problem that we addressed. And here's how we're trying to address that problem or fix that problem, or at least minimize that problem. So now you're related. You're setting up the purpose of why you did the research that you've done. And it's not just that we're just doing research, that there is something that we're trying to address within our field. Okay, and ultimately track your audience. Coming up with a story, come up with a statistic, coming up with something that really makes your audience say, wow, okay, this is something I care about. I want to listen to the rest of it. So like I said, attracting your audience, really it's about linking, or it's about overlapping your motivation and your problem statement with something that your audience ultimately cares about. I was helping another student, she's in the Red Sea research area, and she was talking about how there's kind of two different areas. She's working more on the molecular side of the coral, and you have the other side that are looking more at how the coral is in symbiosis with the fish and the other creatures. And we're talking about what are ways that she can talk about how what she's doing on the molecular side is going to attract the attention of the people that are really more about how the coral are interacting with the fish. So we had to find ways that her research was relevant to them that will make them want to talk. And we kind of brainstormed some ideas about how to do that. But again, it's thinking about who is my audience and not about just what I care about, but how do I find a way that it's going to make them feel like, oh, okay, there is some value to me. Her research or his research is really going to help me maybe get some ideas of how I can further my own research. In the end of the day, we're all a bit selfish that way. We're looking at how is this going to help me? Okay, just want to give you an example of a not so well done introduction. So I'm just going to give you a minute to read this introduction. Okay, so as you can see, not a very exciting introduction. And this is kind of more of a typical introduction where it's not really getting your audience attention. And this is a kind of a typical error that I see in an introduction. Really, as you can see here, it starts off with, first I'm going to talk about this, then I'm going to cover this, and then finally I'm going to cover this. I call this is really just a table of contents. And this is the easy way, this is the comfortable way, and this is the way that a lot of researchers will present, because it's the comfort zone. It's not talking about what is some story or what is some way that I can identify that gets my audience really interested and focused on what is the problem, identifying the problem. This last sentence kind of gets into the problem a bit. 1 billion people worldwide suffer from this area. So that gets you feeling like, okay, 1 billion people is a big number. However, it's really just kind of a table of contents. Now, I'm not saying you don't want to have some sort of table of contents, and this one I'm going to call a home slide, we'll see later. But really, you want to do something that gets a hook, that gets your audience interested in why are you there, what problem you're trying to do, what motivation was, and then say, okay, today I'm going to talk about this and this and this and how we have addressed that problem I stated. So your table of contents part of your introduction should be the last thing. It should be after you've done some sort of interesting introduction that maybe grab the attention of your audience. So let me give you a second version of the same introduction. Okay, so this one obviously more of a big picture issue, maybe not within the scientific gap, but even within scientific gap of your field of the more technical, I think we can still find ways that set up the context of why you're trying to research your area. So this one certainly grabs your attention more, makes you realize just how important this problem is. Even if I didn't know what this disease was, it's got my attention of, wow, this is something we really need to address, and I'm kind of curious to know more about it. So it's at least grabbed my attention of, I want to know more about what is this? Can this affect my family? And what are we doing to fix this big problem that's going on worldwide? So an introduction, like I said, you need to think about a way that you can kind of identify with your audience what that problem is in a way that they can relate to. And then you can maybe, if you ultimately get into, so today I'm going to talk to you about how we can achieve fixing this problem and what I've done in the lab that is really addressing this issue and where we go from here. So maybe then you can give finally your table of contents is the final part of the introduction. Okay, so once we have this introduction, and there are a lot of different ways, it can be a story, it can be an image, it could be maybe statistics, might be some sort of kind of controversial statement that ultimately you're going to prove correctly. There's a lot of different ways. I don't want to get too much into details about introduction, but I'm happy to work with you ever in the future if you want to come to me one-on-one. I want to shift into kind of the body of your story, the scientific story, and what to include in the body. So first of all, I want to focus on what things you should include in the body of your presentation. And then I'm going to give you a couple of do nots, do not do. So let's focus on the things you should do. Again, telling a story of your research journey. So your introduction is defining the problem statement, your motivation, and saying, once upon a time, we had this great thing going on, and then this problem happened, and this problem is the motivation of my story. Then again, we want to describe what are some unique methods. So what did I do differently? What are my novel ways that I've approached this problem compared to what are some other ways that have been done in the past, or what are some ways that are stand in our field? So again, we're focusing on what did I do uniquely? What's the novelness of my research? Not just going through the details of I did this and going through a history lesson of what I did in the lab. We want to focus on what are the unique areas, what are the important areas that perhaps my audience hadn't considered before. You may need to set that up with, here's what the standard is, or here's what's been done recently in the field, and here's where we've taken that even further. So again, thinking about this is going to be different each time. Really, it almost sets up when you think about it kind of like an abstract of a paper. And the abstract of a paper, you're just identifying the key elements. Here, it just gives you an opportunity, a little more time to kind of orally discuss it and give a little more expansive description of that. Then you want to highlight your key findings. So as a result of this unique method, here's some really exciting results that we've been able to accomplish. We had a 30% increase in efficiency based on this one unique method that I've done. And this is really exciting because here's where it fits in our contextual map. This is really exciting because it's fixing or it's addressing that problem that I talked to you about earlier in my introduction when I identified the problem that you really care about as well. Okay, so it's taking you through that journey, but it's taking you through the journey of what was the problem, what did I do differently, and what did I find differently that's really helping minimize that problem more than what's ever been done before. And where are we going from there? Okay. Then I do want to address, you want to give enough detail to your audience that they can assess the validity. Now, I caution you here because when I say enough detail, this is where everyone says, yes, detail, but you don't want to get overload with detail. If you're concerned about having the technicians in the audience say, well, but they don't know what they're talking about, they didn't give a lot of detail, it's too vague. Have an appendix slide, or that's where the question and answer session is there. They say, okay, I noticed this. Can you tell me a little more detail? How did you do it this way? Save that for the technical audience when they have those questions, but don't bore the rest of your audience with going all that detail when the majority of your audience doesn't care about that. Again, maybe it's a lab presentation and all of your audience does care about that. That's fine. There's a time and a place. But the majority of the time you're presenting, it is going to be to a mixed audience where majority of your audience actually doesn't care about that. And as I said, I talked to a lot of students that said, when I go to these presentations, presenters are talking to about 10% of the audience and they've ignored the rest of the 90% of us. We don't want to give so much detail that we're only talking to 10% of your audience. Okay, some things not to do. You don't want to show all your data and findings. This isn't a copy paste of your paper. And quite often I see this, and I see a lot of things in the presentation where the presenter doesn't even talk about. They have a slide or part of a slide that has some data or has a graph, and they just skip through it. And they leave your audience wondering, well, wait a minute, what was that slide about? Or what was that graph about? Why aren't you talking about it? If it's not related to the objective of your presentation, eliminate it. Just, don't make it part of your presentation. So again, this goes back to know what is my objective and making decisions even before I start planning of what goes in and what goes out. Okay. You're not giving a detailed explanation of your methods. I mentioned this. We're not going through a history lesson. The first I did this, then I did this. We want to focus on the unique methods. So focus on, highlight the things that I've done differently. It's the clickbait. What gets people really interested to read the rest of my paper? They can go and read the paper and read all the details later. You want to highlight the part that gets them the most interested. And like I said, in a sense, it really works like an abstract. Also, you don't want to just summarize all your methods. So it's not a way of, I want to talk about all my methods. Really, again, it's not summarizing all your methods, not giving detail of all your methods. It's just identifying which particular methods are novel that I want to focus on, which particular results are novel that are relevant to this objective of this presentation. And there are going to be other parts of your methods, other results that just aren't part of this presentation. Okay. And then you don't want to include details you don't plan to talk about. Like I said, so often I see data points, slides, maybe 2 or 3 slides sometimes where I'll see the presenter just clicking through. Okay, not going to talk about that. Oh, don't have time to talk about that, and moving on. And it's really frustrating for an audience of, wait a minute, you have a slide there, it must be something important. Now you're saying you're not going to talk about it. So that was just poor planning about trying to stay within a time frame and trying to stay within maybe what's important to an audience. So, and I see this constantly where, it's obvious that a presenter is taking a 20-minute presentation that was once done and trying to jam it into 12 minutes or, or whatever the case is. So we want to avoid that. And then finally, you don't need to use the exact same graphs or visuals that are in your paper. And I'm going to get into, when I'm going to talk about the slides, I'm going to give you some examples of this. But I've even seen where students will have like figure 3, and I don't know what figure 3 means in a PowerPoint presentation, because figure 3 means something in your paper, but it certainly doesn't have any value to say figure 3 or figure 6 or whatever in your slides. So that just shows me someone copy pasted right into their slides rather than actually thinking about what part of my data is actually relevant to this particular presentation. Okay, so let's move on to a mixed audience. So students always say that, again, the drawback, or presenters always say, yeah, but in my audience, I have to talk to the technicians in my audience because they're the ones that matter. They're the ones that are listening. They're the ones that are judging me. Yeah, that's great. And there's a way to include them. And if the majority of your audience is that mixed, is that technical group, then that's fine. But you might have, I've gone to, like I said, a lot of these center meetings, these monthly center meetings like Solar Center, Center for Desert Agriculture, Clean Combustion Center, and these presentations, and I see that picture of those, half, the majority of the audience sleeping, because while you have a technical audience, you're only talking to the technicians of your area, but you're not trying to include technicians of other areas that are maybe related, but they don't have the technical background to your specific area. So there are ways and strategies we can include this mixed audience. So 2 bits of advice I want to give you here to help you with that. One, if you see in the title here, one is move from general to specific. Seems obvious, but again, it's quite missed quite often. And the second is use home slides for orientation. I'll get to the home slides in a minute and explain what I mean by that. But first, let's talk about moving from general to specific. So if you have a mixed audience, you have to think about who are the people in that mixed audience. Are there technicians from other fields? Is it an audience of including, half of the audience is a general Kaust audience, maybe people like Matt that have no scientific background? Is it a web presentation where I have SEMC, BESC, PSE people? Is it just PSE? Is it only my center? Who is my audience and how technical is my least technical? So how far back, how general do I go? And, so it's thinking about considering that audience. Once we do that, we want to start with the least technical of my audience and do analogies and set up the problem motivation that they can relate to most. What typically happens is in these centers is someone starts with the specialist and they go, if you go from specific to general, you know most of the audience. What I see really, and I think again, it's a comfort zone of, I know how to talk to the technicians in my audience, so I'm just going to do my presentation to them. I'm not going to take a risk to try to include all my audience. I'm not going to start in this non-technical bit. I'm just going to go and talk to the specialist because that's where I can feel comfortable. Again, it takes a lot of work and it takes you out of your comfort zone to think about how can I relate to people that aren't technicians in my area. It's kind of getting your head in there. Sometimes it might just be a matter of having a conversation with people in those areas. So maybe it's talking to people in your center that maybe aren't in your particular field and say, I'm presenting some of my research. I just want to get an idea of what might be important to you or what you understand, what you don't understand. That might be part of your presentation. So again, what I've seen, and it kind of give you the foreshadowing, is what I typically see in these center meetings is going directly to that 10% of the audience, and the rest of your audience is sleeping, as we saw before. And I talk to these people all the time. I talk to students, I talk to research scientists here in Taos, and I say, what is it that turned you off? And they always say, well, these presenters are just talking to 10% of the audience and they didn't include the rest of us in the beginning. Now, the way to do that is let's start with a non-technical. Start with a big picture. What's the motivation? What's the problem that this least technical in my audience cares about? Now, if you're talking to some technicians in kind of related areas and I'm there and I'm the only non-technician in your field, don't worry about me. You want to think, is there enough of the audience that's in the non-technical bit? Perhaps you don't have any non-technical. Maybe you just have some general technical, but maybe not technical in your field. And maybe your starting point is here. Again, it's kind of identifying what's that problem statement that the majority of my audience can relate to. And then I kind of get them in and get them engaged. And then I can maybe slowly get a little more into detail. So maybe I start with engaging them. And then maybe I can get a little bit more in the technical bit with a slide or two that says, okay, now I'm just talking to the technicians in my audience. You non-technicians, try to follow along, but don't worry, I'll get back to you in a minute. Okay, so rather than just starting here and alienating everybody from the beginning, at least I included everybody in the beginning and I've kind of pushed to the technical. But now what we talked about, the second bit of data, or the second advice I give you is using home slides for orientation. So notice here I have idea 1, idea 2, idea 3, and you're going to have what we call idea-centric slides, which I'll get into in a minute. Let me give you an example of what I use for a home slide. So in the beginning of the talk, I said I'm going to talk about 3 things today. I'm going to talk about before you start, designing your story, and effective slides. So then I had my before you start, and then when we moved on to designing your story, I said, okay, now here's my home slide. So here's idea number 2 that I'm going to focus on. In a minute, you're going to see me bring up effective slides. It's really a roadmap that takes you through my presentation. Where are we in this presentation? Now, the other thing you can do when you do that is going back to here is now if I use my home slide, idea 1, and I highlight idea 2, and I use my voice to say, right, so now let's move on to this area. Now, all your audience who had all this detail you're talking about and were a bit lost, now they realize like, okay, now we're back to idea 2. I'm going to listen again because now we're back into more of a general bit, and hopefully I can follow along if the presenter's done a nice job of including me in the idea 2 before they get too much detail. Okay, so we want to use these home slides. Now, the way to do this is in your organization. And I said, earlier, the mistake that I see a lot of people make, a lot of presenters make is right away they open PowerPoint, Canva, some sort of slide bit, and they just start making their slides and they say, okay, I want to talk about this and this and this. It's usually disorganized. You're not saying this comes before this when it really should. And it's really hard for your audience to follow your story. What you want to do is think about idea-centric. So we want to have idea-centric slides. So what's idea 1? So idea 1 might be, what's the problem or the motivation for my research? Idea 2 might be, what is method number 1 that I did? Maybe idea 3 is, what is method number 2? Maybe idea 2 is method 1 and idea 3 is result 1. And then maybe you have idea 4, method 2, result 2. Think about idea centric. What are the big picture ideas I want to present? Once you've done that, now what slides, what data can I add that's supporting that idea? So if idea 2 is method 1, that idea should support the objective of my presentation. If that idea supports the objective of my presentation, and then slides of my data support that idea, now everything's linked. I'm not adding data that really has nothing to do with the big picture objective. So I want to think about what are the ideas that I want to present? Are these ideas related to my big picture objective, my ultimate objective of my presentation? If not, take that idea out and only focus on ideas that relate to that big picture objective. Now, once I know those ideas, am I idea centric? Now let me think of slides and data that are going to help support that idea. Images, whatever the case, that my audience can fully understand what I'm trying to present. Okay. Now this idea 1, idea 2, idea 3, however many ideas they are, those should be represented in some way in this home slide. So when you're moving from one onto the next, now you bring up this home slide. So that's that roadmap. So every time you're moving from one idea to the next, you bring up that home slide, as you saw with mine, with the next kind of highlighted bit. And that helps your audience understand, okay, now we're moving on to the next area. You know, maybe I was a bit lost in some of the details by the end of the last idea, but now we're back to big picture. Now let me follow along again. So it's a way to engage your audience and bring them back in. While you were talking to some of the technicians, now I'm saying, okay, all of you come back. I'm focusing on all of you again. Okay. The third part of your presentation is going to be your conclusion. This isn't a conclusion of my talk. I got a little bit more on slides, but I want to talk about a conclusion when you're concluding your presentation. Often gets overlooked, and I think it's really unfortunate because the conclusion is that's your lasting view. That's what people are going to remember most of your presentation, quite honestly. And the number one thing that I always see students do is they're going through, or not students, presenters, they're going through, they're talking, and then suddenly this slide comes up, thank you, and I see a student kind of almost look as shocked as the audience that the presentation is finished. And quite often the presenter, I see the presenter, they look shocked and they look a bit relieved that the presentation is finished, because they're like, ah, finally I'm done, and I got it done with, I'm over with, Again, quite often it's not about communication, they're just trying to just get through it. But if you plan and organize well, you won't have to worry about just getting through it. You can actually present and communicate effectively. So what we want to do for an effective conclusion, and really you only need about 30 seconds to do this. 1 or 2 sentences can be a really effective conclusion, but you just want to at least address it. 3 different methods you can do. One is maybe a summary of key points. So I just want to wrap up what I talked about today is this, and then this, and then this, and then, thank you. So maybe just some sort of just easy little summary of here's what I've talked about today. It shows to your audience that you cared and you kind of wound down your presentation rather than just finishing abruptly. Another way, really effective way, is to link back to your motivation. So I'd say, so if you remember in the beginning of the talk, I talked about this problem that we're all really addressing. As you can see, these results are really novel in some really exciting ways. And here's how we hope that these ways can address these problems in the future and continue to go going forward. Essentially the discussion section of your paper, but in a really abbreviated way of linking your results of how they go back into that problem that you identified earlier. Like I said, it's really a discussion section of a paper, but just in a short 30-second way. Finally, in a bigger picture audience, maybe a less scientific audience, you might have some sort of takeaway message, call to action, kind of some motivating your audience to go do something after your talk. Usually this is more of a less scientific talk, if you have a more of a general audience. But again, depending on your audience, that might be really effective as well. Okay, finally, moving on to my home slide. The last thing I want to talk about, just the last few minutes here, is effective slides, how to create effective slides. So notice this is the last thing I put, before you start thinking about who's your audience, what's my objective, what am I going to do, what am I including, not including, then I'm going to design my story. How do I design my outline? What am I going to talk about first? What am I going to talk about after? All of that should be done before you really open up and start doing your slides. You should have those ideas created. The idea is, what data do I want to use to support those ideas? Okay, now that I know that and I kind of have my storyboard laid out, now let's open our slides, and now we can start creating slides that support that story, support those ideas and my big picture objective. Okay, so let me show you this slide. So basically this is kind of a slide I use to explain some information. I'm sure one of a few things is happening at the moment. Some of you are probably looking at the picture, trying to analyze the picture. Some of you are probably looking at the red bit right down and the below because it's a different color and maybe grabbed your attention. Some of you are trying to read the bullet points. Very small percentage of you are maybe still listening to me at this point. And some of you are probably trying to listen to me while you're trying to read all this information that's going on in the slide. My point is this slide is just way too much information, too much data going on in the slide, and it's just distracting to you as the listener, right? So you don't know where to focus your attention. Do you listen to me? Do you look at the picture? Do you try to read all these words going on? We don't want to do that. So what we want to do is try to control our audience attention. Get your audience to focus on the things that matter while you're talking about them and not look ahead. So the way to do this is bring things in one at a time, animations within your slides. So we want to bring things in as we talk about them and then help support. So we want the slides to support us rather than us supporting the slides. So the way we can do this is as I'm talking, we want to avoid having all of this data dump going on in the whiteboard and kind of have this nice little tidy kind of package presentation going on for our audience. So what are some ways we can do that? First of all, we don't want to just put a lot of our data and extra things on our paper or on our presentation that are in our paper that really aren't relevant to the objective of our presentation. Again, we want to stay true to the objective. And again, if we stay to our objective, what are ideas that support the objective? What are slides that support the idea? Then this should be really easy. It's easy to make decisions of that part of my paper doesn't belong in a presentation. Second, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Look, you're scientists, you have a lot of data. You're going to have a lot of data that's done in picture form. You're going to have graphs and charts in different ways. Use those to your advantage. You don't really need to have a lot of bullet points. I've had a lot more. This is really more about a lecture than presenting my data. But you're going to be much more image driven in your presentations than word driven, text driven. If you don't talk about it, don't include it. I've mentioned this many times. I'll continue to mention it because I just see it happen. I challenge you when you go watch presentations, tell me, think about how many times you see people just clicking over things without talking about them. And it's just really distracting and it's pointless. It's easy to just move it out of your slide and it's not necessary. Okay. Don't show it until you talk about it. Now I'm going a bit extreme here, bringing up one bullet at a time. However, if you think it's going to distract your audience from what you're trying to say and distract them from listening to you, then avoid showing it on your slide until you're going to move into that point. And I'm going to give you some examples in a moment. Okay. Use so what titles. This is really critical. So what titles. So what I mean is, if you have data, you don't want your title to say number of widgets sold, for example, and that just tells you what the data is telling me. That's not telling me what I care about. So quite often when I work with presenters, I say, okay, what do you want your audience to learn from this slide? And they're like, well, I want them to know that what we did increased widget sales by 30%. So, okay, so that's your title of your slide. It's not widget sales, which tells me, what I'm looking, and now the audience has to look through your data to try to find out what the purpose is. It's rather to say, our changes increased widget sales by 30%. That's the takeaway message. So now when they're looking at your data, they're looking at your data for a specific purpose to support your takeaway message, your so what title. So don't use what titles, use so what. Use the takeaway message. What's the purpose of, what do you want your audience to learn from that particular slide? Okay, so remember, your audience will listen to you or read your slide, but they're not going to do both. As much as we think we're multitaskers, we're not. So try to really focus your audience on you and let your slides support what you're saying, but don't let your audience focus on your slides. Make them focus on you. Let them get the data information to support you from the slide as quickly as possible, and then you listen to you and listen to your explanation. Okay, I have a couple examples of some slides. So first of all, here's one. I don't know if you've all seen this before. This was a famous slide that was once done. I think it was a United Nations presentation. As you can imagine, it's a bit dizzying, as you're looking through. It's not really supporting at all what the presenter was trying to say. I don't know what the presenter was trying to say. Even, I could study this slide for an hour and probably still really not know what the purpose of this slide is. This is quite obviously not a good graphic unless the purpose of your presentation, purpose of this slide is to show what not to do, as I'm using it for. And it seems so obvious. However, what I want to show you is probably quite a few of you are doing similar type of distracting over data dump in your slides from your scientific perspective. So let me give you an example of one way that it's done by presenters in scientific fields. One is you may see something like this. I'm going to admit to you, I have no idea what any of this means. If it even means anything, it's a copy paste. I stole this from Google somewhere. So I don't know if it means anything to any of you or to anybody. However, as I'm talking again, we have loads of information going on here. It's very unlikely the audience is going to listen to me as I talk about all these different elements. And it's just distracting. So now really my audience has tuned me out and they're trying to read this and trying to analyze and understand, especially someone who's scientifically related to this field. They're just going to try to interpret and not actually listen to me. So here's what I mean about bringing things in one at a time. So, maybe what we can do is bring something in as I'm talking about one key element. And then in the next part of the novel method, here's what we did. And we added this and we came up to here. Then we add in the next section of our method, we did this. Finally, we went here and then we went here. So as I'm talking about each component, I'm bringing it in and ready to use that, let that to support me. So now the audience is only focusing on the part that I'm talking about. They understand that. So when I bring in the next part, they only have to focus on that one part and just continue along the journey of my presentation and the journey I'm taking them on, whether it's about my result or my method or whatever the case is. So this is one area that's typical for scientists is, you're going to have maybe different diagrams of polymers, isomers, I'm trying to throw out some scientific words, showing my scientific ignorance here. Another way is with graphs, quite common, we use graphs again, very visually. So notice here, we got 4 graphs going on. Here's an example. I said I put figure 2 on the bottom, which really means nothing to anybody. Why would they be figure 2 in my data, in my presentation? Now in this one, again, like my audience, if I'm talking about one kind of area and trying to compare 2 parts, my audience is looking at everything and they're distracted. So better would be to bring in one part and say, okay, by comparison, here's, the results that we received compared to, what's going on in the data or going on in the literature. And then we talk about 3 and 4. Now, the other thing is maybe these bottom 2 graphs really have nothing to do with my presentation and the objective of my presentation. Maybe they're related to my paper and their data in my paper. But for this particular presentation, only these top 2 graphs really mean anything. So again, it's making those decisions, and I keep saying, like, don't include things you're not going to talk about. I've seen this loads of times where someone talks about the top 2, never talk about the bottom 2, and your audience wondering, why are those there? Am I missing something? Am I not understanding something? So, think about, do I only need to bring in these 2? And I maybe need to make some changes to the figure that was in my graph or in my paper rather. And again, making those decisions. Okay. Finally, another way that you can express data is through tables. So I have a table here. It's quite confusing. When I teach this as a course, I always ask my students, so what do you think my objective is of this table? Nobody can come up with an objective, or I get 10 different objectives because it's really not clear. My title doesn't help me at all with understanding the objective. The title just says number of speakers in the largest language groups. All that's telling me is what the table is telling me, but it doesn't tell me what takeaway message I should get from the table. There's no so what title. So more effective is to think about, what is the objective I want my audience to take from here? What do I want them to learn from this table? Again, it might be different than the paper. And I can use shadowing, I can use either changing font color. Here I'm highlighting just a particular data set that I want to show. I probably even these where I put in the background, I could maybe even eliminate these. I don't need to show them. And I have a so what title, the takeaway message I want my audience to learn here. 4 times more people learn English as a second language than Mandarin Chinese. And quite honestly, I'm thankful for that, because my job as an English language teacher, this keeps me employed for a longer term, hopefully, and keeps bringing me to hopefully do more talks like this that Natalia graciously brought me in. So with that, I want to leave you with one final concluding message. I want to practice what I preach. I said I always have some concluding, some wrap up. So I want to conclude with what I hope you remember by the end of today. And this is kind of the analogy of an iceberg. And what I'll tell you is I get students constantly coming to me and saying, help me, I gave a presentation, it was terrible. I feel so horrible. I just felt so embarrassed. I felt shy. I just wanted to get transported back to my home country, as one student told me once. And they all focus on how can I get better at the presentation day, which is the 20% that people focus on. What they really don't understand, and what I tried to really kind of emphasize today, is that 80% of your presentation is done behind the scenes. And I get so many people saying, wow, that person, what an amazing presenter they are. They're just a naturally gifted presenter because they focus on that 20% of presentation day. What they don't realize is all the hard work and the weeks and the time and the effort that went into the 80% of preparing and then planning the presentation. So what they've done is they thought about who their audience was. They decided an objective of the presentation. Ultimately, they developed a story that linked into that objective, and they created very effective slides that supported those ideas. And by doing all those things, they were well prepared to give a good presentation and much more confident on presentation day. So with that, I thank you for your time. I'll leave you with just kind of my contact information. Feel free if anybody ever